And I think what we're going to try and do in this first panel is delve a little bit deeper into what Congressman Smith put on the table. Like, what are the big security threats in the Indo-Pacific region? We have three expert speakers on this panel who collectively have a wealth of experience analyzing, assessing, responding to security threats in the region. I'm going to briefly introduce them. Their full bios are in the package of materials that you have, so I'd encourage you to look at those. And I'm going to go down the line and ask each of them an opening question in turn. And then we'll open up for questions from the floor, just as we did for Congressman Smith. Again, if you have a question, please head toward one of the microphones at the back of the room, and we'll take you from there. Our first speaker, Elaine Bunn, has had a 40-year career in the US government, 20 years at OSD working on a range of nuclear security, missile defense issues, and time at the National Defense University, government career culminating as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy from 2013 to 2017. Now she's happily out of government as an independent consultant. She has visiting fellowships at CSIS and the National Defense University in Washington and the Royal United Services Institute in London. And so, Elaine, it's a broad question for you, but I think drawing on your experience in government and specifically the issues that you worked on, what's your perspective on the key security challenges in the Indo-Pacific for the United States and its allies and partners?
Well, I see the two big ones as being the rise of China and the two near peer issue that seems to be dominating Washington right now. It's evident in the National Defense Strategy, two nuclear posture reviews, lots of outside studies. How do you deal with two near nuclear peers? I mean, sometimes it's called the tripolar problem, or the two near peer, the two emerging peers, whatever. But that seems to be the one that is dominating the Beltway these days. The second, of course, that I think we cannot forget is that North Korea has nuclear weapons. It's not that I accept them as a nuclear nation, but I think they've made enough progress in their testing of missiles and nuclear weapons that we have to focus on how do we deter aggression from North Korea under the nuclear shadow. And so those seem to be the two biggest challenges right now. The rise of China militarily, the fact that it is moving quicker than most in the intelligence world had predicted that they would move, with certainly on the nuclear front, but also in other areas as well, conventionally, cyberspace and so forth. That's a big challenge. And we can talk later about how we deal with it, but those seem to be the two big ones.
Thank you. Our second speaker, Brian Davis, has had a 35-year career as a U.S. Army officer, served as a China FAO, assignments at OSD in Washington, D.C., 3 tours at the embassy in Beijing, including one as defense attaché 2018 to 2020. He finished his military career as Brigadier General and Director of the Strategic Focus Group at Indo-Pacom from 2021 to 2022. Right now, Brian is the Director for China Research at BluePath Labs, as well as a Fellow at the Center for Naval Analysis and an advisor to CSIS. So, Brian, exactly the same question for you. Thinking about your career in the region, the key security challenges in the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to NBR for asking me to participate in this panel. I think the key, everybody's talked about it, Elaine mentioned it, and Congressman Smith, but it's how great power competition, or major power competition, is playing out in the Indo-Pacific and the implications of that. And so, we've talked, for the most part, it's U.S.-China, but Russia is a major power in the region, and India increasingly. So how those dynamics play out, I think it's pretty critical. And especially in the case of U.S.-China, but not exclusively, it's characterized by increased rhetoric. It's characterized by decreased cooperation. And a good example of that is the two major countries in the world involved in that can actually make a difference in climate change, the United States and China, and we're really not talking to each other. There's, of course, the accelerating regional arms race, both conventional and nuclear, and especially in the case of China, but not exclusively, increased information warfare and more sophisticated information warfare, both in the region and globally, and also influence operations, again, especially China, manifested from the Chinese Communist Party United Front Work Department. I think a dangerous subset of this is where China is. You have a country whose military continues to grow and demonstrate increased capabilities. But at the same time, the Chinese economy is arguably plateauing or potentially even starting into a state of decline. Also, the demographics of China starting to plateau and decline. And then at the same time, you have Xi Jinping and how he has changed the role of the party, shifted from more of a collective decision-making process of the party senior leaders to more Xi Jinping at the center. You have an increasingly brittle Communist Party. You have an increased focus on China's internal and external security and shifting away from modernization. And as this plays out in the region, we're really talking about a dangerous time.
Thanks, Brian. Our third speaker is our colleague at NBR, Nadège Rolland, who's the Distinguished Fellow in China Studies. I've had the good fortune to work with her for close to a decade. She's led groundbreaking work at NBR on China's Belt and Road Initiative, but more recently, fascinating work trying to understand China's strategic ambitions. How does the elite in Beijing think about the world? What is it trying to achieve? What are its objectives? And she comes to NBR after a 20-year career as a senior advisor on China and Asia at the French Ministry of Defense. So a similar wealth of experience. But Nadège, Brian's kind of taken, I think, Elaine's point on China a little bit deeper. Let me ask you to extend that further. Two questions for you. In your own personal assessment, what are the big security challenges in the region? But put yourself then in the shoes of sitting in Beijing, being part of the party. How does China view the security environment in the region?
Well, thanks, Michael. And that was exactly what I had in mind, actually flipping the question to what China thinks instead of what I think, because what I think is not really important here. The challenges that both have described are basically, in essence, the same as they were 10 years ago. Militarization, nuclearization, territorial disputes, rise of nationalism. If you look at it, it's the same trend. It's just that it's deepened and accelerated. And part of it is due, in effect, to China's rise. But I think most importantly, at least from my side, because this is what I do all day long, is try to understand how Beijing's elite see the international environment that they're in. And I think it's very like monorail kind of thinking. It's U.S. the West, U.S. the West, U.S. encirclement, containment, and suppression. That's their own perception. External hostile forces that are there to limit and contain China's legitimate rise on the international stage. And that really trickles down into every single domain you can think of. So from where they stand, it's not just the military alliances and the regional partnerships that the US have in the region that basically almost physically pressure China in an arc or C-shape or Q-shape, noose encirclement. It's also what they call protectionism that has been accelerating from the US side on the trade and tech domains. And it's also an existential ideological threat. So a threat to the party survival, because what the US stands for and is antithetical to what the CCP stands for and is. So I think that what has shifted really in the past 10 years It's not really the array of challenges, but it's the power of China and how they perceive their own power and what they want to do with it. And as their own material power has grown, they feel like they're bumping against a lot of external pressure. Not that this was not real before, but now they have more ways to push against it. And so it's multidimensional. And I would say, so it's not just security in the terms of military sense. It's economic security. It's the sort of vision for the future kind of security, vision for the future of the region, but also vision for the future of the world. So it's not just like security, the security lens is much broader, and the geographical lens is also much broader. It's not Northeast Asia anymore. It's not East Asia even. It's not Indo-Pacific even. It goes all the way up to the international system and the contest of systems as well.
So I want to unpack something that you said at the beginning there. So China sort of has a singular view that the West, the US, is a threat. And I'm interested because that is a simple way of looking at the security dilemma in a way that Rich's question to Adam Smith just now was suggesting we're actually facing a more complicated situation where you've got, it's not just a China problem, it's a China problem, it's a Russia problem, it's a North Korea problem. So I'm going to come down the line again, Elaine first, but not necessarily from the China perspective, but if you think about this interplay between the rise of China as one challenge, but these other security complexes in the mix as well, how well are our systems for understanding and dealing with those suited to this much more complicated multipolar system? And especially in the nuclear dimension, where we've had a Cold War period of bipolar deterrence, and now we're facing a much more complicated scenario now.
That is exactly what I see a lot of experts in the security field wrestling with right now. It's the first time we've ever faced two big nuclear powers, major countries. China was always kind of a lesser included case in our minds, certainly in the nuclear field. And when you have a declining Russia, makes it very dangerous. It's declining. It does not have the future that China has. A rising China, and they declare a partnership without limits. Who knows exactly what it means? Is it opportunistic? Will it last? Who knows? But when they've said that they both don't like the U.S. rules-based international, the U.S. created basically after World War II, rules-based international order, and it doesn't suit them. It doesn't fit what they would like to see. That dynamic between those two is one that we are still trying to figure out how to deal with. And then you add in a North Korea, which, you know, it's long been one of those problems without great solutions countries. But then you add in a North Korea that sometimes China is annoyed with and sometimes not, sometimes allied, sometimes as close as lips and teeth and sometimes not. And you add in now Russia, Putin going to North Korea for, certainly it seems that he wants munitions from North Korea. What is it that North Korea, besides money, is getting from Russia? So again, is it help in their submarine program? Is it, what is it that North Korea is getting? So you get this, yes, two near nuclear peers with the added North Korea is always going to raise its head and go, don't forget us, and make problems. And then where's Iran in all this? So yeah, the multiplicity and interactions among these players is new and different, and I don't know that anybody's got the right way to deal with it yet.
Let me follow up very quickly. One last thing. You were just in Seoul, is that right? Thinking about the the Washington Declaration, President Yoon and President Biden announced earlier this year, has that sufficiently assuaged the South Koreans from wanting to develop an independent nuclear deterrent? Because over the last couple of years, we've seen that debate rise up more significantly.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the polls in South Korea for years now have shown 60, 70% of the public will say, yes, we should have our own indigenous nuclear weapons. And yes, the U.S. should forward deploy nuclear weapons here like they did pre-1991. So you get both those strands in the South Korean public. And then in January, of course, when President Yoon speculated unofficially about if things get worse with North Korea, maybe we'll need to have our own or have weapons deployed here again. That got some attention. And I think the Washington Declaration, where President Yoon recommitted South Korea to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also got some gives from President Biden as well. The most significant of which, I believe, is Biden's commitment that the United States would consult with South Korea on any potential use of nuclear weapons on the peninsula. That is something that South Korea has wanted for a long time, and that was the first time that kind of commitment had been made, especially at a presidential level. There were other things, the other implementation steps, a nuclear consultative group, which sounds a lot like a nuclear planning group ministerial that NATO has, because South Korea and Japan have often wanted a NATO-like structure for nuclear consultations. All the exercises and the that sort of thing that flow from that very important commitment, I think will satisfy for a while.
Okay.
While.
Thank you. Brian, let's pick up on this idea of U.S. alliances, U.S. partners. As you're looking at the security situation, as you were looking at the security situation from PACOM or previous postings that you had in the Army, to what extent is that alliance network helpful in protecting U.S. interests? And does it complicate China's ability to push back? I mean, to the extent, so I'm unpacking some of the questions we had in the first session this morning. How important are allies and partners? How best should the United States work with them to achieve goals? And is our alliance system and the multiplicity of that an advantage if you flip the lens around and look at China and say, this is a country that really doesn't have many allies. It's got partners of convenience, but there's no trust there. So delve into that a little bit for me.
Well, I think Congressman Smith said it very well. It's absolutely critical to a situation of stability and security in the Pacific region. For us, it's critical we are a long way away here in Seattle from the East China Sea, South China Sea, and we need partners in the region who, not just like-minded partners, liberal democracies, but others, to be able to work together and cooperate. The system of alliances that we have and have had in the past are obviously more bilateral. We have the 5 allies in the region. But one of the things that's been interesting as you see regional nations' response to China and its increased strength, increased economic heft, military heft, and its increased willingness to exercise power is that not only are those bilateral alliances strengthening, good example is our alliance with Japan, our alliance with South Korea, but also you're seeing more collaboration and cooperation between like-minded partners in the region. You see that in ASEAN, you see that with the Quad, although the Quad's not a security relationship, it's otherwise, but you do see a security aspect of that. And I think really interesting, and it's played out since I left PACOM a year ago, is the South Korea, Japan, U.S. trilateral collaboration. Obviously not an alliance, but it's certainly a strengthening relationship that holds promise. And especially if you go down the nuclear route, you have 2 countries that have the ability potentially to develop nuclear weapons, but are under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. However, both of them feel threatened by North Korea. Japan especially feels threatened by China. And those dynamics will be interesting as they play out. But my personal opinion is that alliance system will continue to strengthen, and there may not be a Northeast Asia NATO like the Chinese accuse us of trying to form, but I do think it will be much more robust than what we see today.
Maybe I can ask you a couple controversial questions then. So you've looked at the easy partners, Japan, South Korea. Those relationships undoubtedly are as strong as they've ever been. Let's think about the U.S. alliance relationship with the Philippines, especially in light of what's going on in the South China Sea right now. And also the U.S. alliance relationship with Thailand, which is perennially difficult because of the domestic political situation in Thailand. Are you optimistic about where those alliance relationships might go?
I'm optimistic about the Philippines, and you've seen, obviously, since Duterte left office, you've seen a change in how Manila approaches its relationship with the United States, economically, diplomatically, militarily. Obviously, China has a huge role in that. If China were not as aggressive in the South China Sea, Manila probably wouldn't be as more forward and deepening not just the relationship with us, but also allowing increased U.S. military presence in the Philippines and potential access in the event of a conflict. With Thailand, I'm less optimistic. They obviously are a treaty ally, but that relationship has been very unique. And if you think about how the U.S. and its alliance relationships around the world have played out, the Thai are very good at hedging, and they're very good at playing great powers off against each other. And I actually served in the embassy in Thailand as well, and during a period of extreme political violence. And I'm optimistic with how the process is trending in the recent election, but I also know that it's still Thailand, and there's always going to be some level of playing the U.S. and China off against each other. But it's still a great relationship in many other ways.
Thanks. Nadège, one more question from me, and then certainly encourage folks in the room to head toward the microphones at the back. Adam Smith, in his opening remarks, talked about the need to continue to find ways to cooperate with China at the same time as we're competing with China. And this is a framework that we hear very often from Western policymakers. Again, I'm asking you to sit yourself in Beijing, look at this from a Chinese perspective. Does China distinguish security concerns and other concerns? Do they differentiate them in the same way that we do? Or is there a different way that Beijing views security issues and economic issues or other areas of interaction with the West?
The short answer to that is no, they don't differentiate, because everything is considered through the lenses of raw power. So even economic exchanges are seen through that lens. And it's like the interdependence that economic and trade have created is not seen as something that will help everybody lift their boat, but as something that can be used as leverage for a political result or political outcome. And that's important to keep in mind as the US is trying to work with partners and allies and gaining and working on trust and working together on deterring China. China is not necessarily looking for building its own alternative alliances, but certainly is looking at the potential seams between the US and their partners. And those seams and weak points and vulnerabilities and disagreements that could arise between Washington and partners in the region, but also in Europe, and sometimes are not related, again, to the military issues, but to the economic issues and to the other instruments as well. I think they're looking for the weakest link in general, and like this idea of playing, I mean, the countries in the region and also elsewhere where China's footprint is increasing, all want to play great powers against each other. But China is going there and playing the game fully and comprehensively, with the US as its main target. Whereas the US goes there, and because they think that the local countries don't want to be caught in great power competition, refuse to say, because they feel like this will not be well received to talk about China as a challenge nowadays. And I've been talking with people in the administration, and they don't want to frame it as, the China challenge or the great power competition, because their partners or counterparts told them, we don't want to be caught in between. We don't want to choose. We don't want to have to choose. I don't think that China really is so timid and shy and going into those places and say, we have an alternative model, we have an alternative path to offer that is not the one that the US has, or the Western powers have given you before. So again, it goes very much beyond the military, and it goes beyond the region, I think, in this case.
Stay with the mic just for a second. So this weakest link idea, I'd like to come back down the panel. What are you most concerned about, Nadège? Which is the weakest link that you're worried about right now?
It's very opportunistic, so it will depend on the moment. So I think the Leninist view is that if you strike steel, you with your bayonet, you just withdraw. But if you strike mush, you continue to push. And the general idea of the Chinese strategy is activating the least effort for the greater outcome. So it's not like if they see something, if they see a cohesive West that is really, rallying together on all fronts, at the minimum, showing it to the outside world as a cohesive group, they're not going to try to poke at the seams. But if whatever they can feel like is not going great, they're going to try to push. So, for example, from a European perspective, there's this idea of strategic autonomy of Europe. We're neither nor. We are our own. We are able to defend ourselves, and yes, we're allies to the Americans, but we have our own abilities. And Beijing is endorsing this idea. Of course, this is a great idea. You should be autonomous. You're not the lackeys of the Americans. So this is an example of a theme that they're playing at, and that they're then publicizing and repeating. So I don't have any specific concern about any specific country or any specific topic, because I feel like it's a moving target. But this sort of overarching principle is something that we have to keep in mind if we want to put a united front.
So you're advocating we have a united front policy.
We should
counter China's united front policy.
But this is the game that we're playing.
Let me come down, Brian and Elaine, if I can. Nadège dodged this a little bit, but put you on the spot. Are there specific instances that you're concerned about, these weak links, whether it's inside the Indo-Pacific region or outside the region, that you see China pushing at?
From my perspective, I think the weak link is how China is exploiting the perception that the U.S. is not committed to Asia. And I say perception. I think it's very clear that Washington is committed to Asia, even if it hasn't. It doesn't always manifest itself in what we do, but China is very good at playing on that perception. So, for example, when we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they got a lot of mileage with that. And so even if the U.S. administration, the current one, the previous one, and whatever the next one would look like, are committed to Asia, there's always going to be instances or issues that China can pull that thread. And Congressman Smith talked about the political divide in Washington. That's a huge, huge weakness on our part that the Chinese were able to target, engaging with partners in the region or our partners in the region. So that's something that I think will be critical for us to get ahead of that. We're committed. Our partners in other nations, they hear that from us all the time, but there still is that perception in the region that the U.S. isn't fully committed.
Thanks, Elaine.
Yeah, I do have a particular instance of China trying to drive wedges in alliances. It's about 2016, and the U.S. decided it was going to deploy the THAAD missile defense system to Korea because we have 35,000 or so troops there. South Korea wanted to do its own indigenous missile defense system, and so they've been developing that. But we also wanted to deploy the THAAD there, and so lots of back and forth. Obviously, South Korea agreed to this. China did not like this at all. There were. I really still to this day not sure whether it was this just showed again, a strength of an alliance and our commitment to the South Koreans, or whether they really believed that that radar could see something in China that they didn't want us to see. They made several different arguments there. I'm not sure what it was, but it seemed kind of opportunistic. And because South Korea's biggest trading partner is China, they had an economic lever there. And for about a year thereafter, they used that economic lever. And South Korea has not forgotten that one. So that was one of those where, South Korea had said for a while, gee, economic partner, security ally, we don't have to choose between the two. But China made it hard for them not to choose.
Great. I see we have some folks starting to stand up at the back here. If you've not yet asked a question, please introduce yourself when you ask your question. If you've already introduced yourself, just go ahead and ask. And Admiral Green, you're up first.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is it on? Who cares? I have two questions. My first question is for Elaine, and it's based on one of your earlier summaries. And another question I'd ask Brian and Nadège to comment upon. Elaine, I read an article recently that said, look, our approach to nuclear policy, you kind of have to shred that and think of it because the challenge is fundamentally different than what the challenge was when we started this approach in our nuclear policy. It's been decades, and we're iteratively changing it. You have to change it all. So I wondered what your thoughts were in this. And from this perspective, as you summarize, you got the Russia challenge. We're familiar with that. Now you got the China challenge. And the foundation of these are different for a whole host of reasons. We've gone back and forth and had agreements with Russia. We have zero with China. Now you got the North Korea, which is not 5 nuclear weapons. We're in the tens, and we're not doing anything. So it's just going to grow. And there's this third, which is not really the topic, Iran. We have nothing to prevent, to my knowledge, Iran from getting a nuclear weapon now. Nothing tangible that will stop that. And so what say you on this article? I'll read my second question and then I'll sit down. For Brian and Nadège, as I'm thinking about changes recently, and this is really about China and what's happening out there, and are we, doggone it, we are marching on our way to conflict. And I'm thinking, well, some of this stuff in the South China Sea is more of the same. It may be more of it, but it's kind of more of the same. You got the Scarborough Shoal, you got the Rustin Philippine ship, you got flights in Taiwan Straits. Well, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch more. I know, but it is the same stuff. Or am I missing something? So my question is for Brian and Nadège, in each of your respective areas, are we in a new area of potential of where we could stumble into conflict, or do we just have to watch out, be careful with what is already going on, and it has been going on, frankly, for a decade? Lastly, we've talked a lot about what's going on internal to China, what's going on internal to the United States, but my question really involves, but what's happening in the theater? And is there something there that should put us on a more alert, more vigilant posture than maybe we've had in the past? Hopefully these questions make sense. I'm not sure I got them after I rambled so much. Thank you.
I will interpret the question as I wish. So, the on the nuclear deterrence issue, and that is the key, and that is what we're trying to do, is deter both nuclear use and aggression under the nuclear shadow by nuclear armed states. And I used to tell my kids when they were little, you're trying to describe to them, what does mommy do for, what's mommy's job? And I would say, mommy's job is to try to help make sure that no really big wars happen. And so that really is my mission statement when I talk about nuclear deterrence. It's and so I'm not sure that the fundamentals of trying to deter someone else from thinking they can either use nuclear weapons against you or yours, meaning your allies or partners, and that is different. We are different in that regard, that we try to extend that deterrence to allies. So that idea of trying to prevent that, as well as aggression under that nuclear shadow, again, big wars. So the fundamental of deterrence and holding at risk what your adversary values, so that they won't even think about taking that action you don't want them to take. I'm not sure that has changed. Figuring out what it is that a Russian leadership, at this point a Putin, versus a Xi, versus a Kim Jong-un, really cares about, and what you hold at risk in order to deter them from doing the really terrible things. That's where the art comes in. It's not really a science. I mean, it's lots of intel. It's lots of trying to understand how people make decisions and all those kinds of things. I'm not sure that has changed. When you have a couple of larger nuclear powers that may get together or just be opportunistic and saying, oh, you're tied up over there? Fine. We'll do what we always wanted to do over here, even though we didn't coordinate this, but we have an opportunity. That's when the nuclear deterrence part gets hard. As I said before, you can't count China as a lesser included case. We're still counting North Korea that way as a lesser included case from a force structure standpoint. The big debate is now, how much is enough? It's again, we're back to the six. How much is enough? What do we think deters? So that's my take on the nuclear deterrence piece and how it's changed. Right. Yes, and that's the, does it really deter an adversary if they think there's no chance in the world you would ever use it if they do what you said, don't do that? If they don't think you would use it, then it probably doesn't deter. So what do they think is, because they know that we abide by the laws of armed conflict, even when we're thinking nuclear. So what do they think is proportionate? What do they think is that we think? In other words, do they think we have the right thing? Do they think we would use an SLBM from Bangor if they did a very low yield, limited nuclear use? Do they think we would do that or not? So that's the big debate now, is how do you make it credible to the other guy?
Pause there, and Brian and Nadège unpack Admiral Greener's broader question about step change increase in threats or more of the same.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So I think it's a little bit of both. It is absolutely more of the same, maybe on a higher level, higher scale. But what's different is you have a stronger and more capable China, arguably more confident, but at the same time, also more paranoid and brittle. And if you look at the U.S.-China military relationship 20 years ago, when I was in my first tour in Beijing, and Roy and I were actually there for the EP3 crisis at the same time, and we had a communication mechanism with the PLA and between our two governments that was able to settle that. Not necessarily the way the Chinese wanted it settled or the United States wanted it settled, but it was settled peacefully. There was, except for the accident itself, there was no loss of life. But I don't think we're in that situation now. If we were to have another version of the EP3, or if a Japanese aircraft was to collide with a Chinese aircraft, or a Philippine ship collides with a Chinese Coast Guard ship. I think we're in a much different situation because of how Beijing has changed, how the party has changed under Xi Jinping, and I mentioned that in my opening comments. And that's a different world. And you look at the United States and China. Yes, we have communications mechanisms. We did not have a defense telephone link between the Department of Defense and the PLA in 2001, and we have it now, but it's never been tested in a crisis. In fact, I would argue that if we did have a crisis, Chinese aren't going to pick up that phone. And so we go back to 2016 with the unmanned underwater vehicle seizure by the Chinese. It was actually the attaché office in Beijing and their PLA counterparts that were more of the interlocutors. And that's not necessarily something that you, as say you were a Pacific Command commander or Secretary of Defense or a president, would really want to have in a crisis as it could play out today. I agree. And in many ways, regardless of what happens, the truth is the first casualty. And so the truth will become whatever the party has accepted as the truth. And that's if they're responding to something, let alone if they've actually created a crisis to achieve a political end.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's same but different. I sort of agree that we're in a different era, but I would also disagree because the assertiveness of China in the South China Sea that didn't happen in 2014 after Xi Jinping came to power. It happened under Hu Jintao, 2009. You remember very well, Admiral. So I think in terms of like objectives and what the party wants, it's basically the same. Xi Jinping has accelerated something that was there all along. It's just that the main difference again is the power that they have in their hands to achieve their objectives. I guess what your question was leading us to think about is whether this incremental, like drip, is going to lead us to conflict or not. I think sometimes just the threat of conflict, this assertiveness, this rambunctious posture is actually, from the Chinese perspective, as valuable as the conflict itself. In other words, the threat of military conflict is a very important card that they're playing to deter action and to sort of put in the minds of strategic planners in the US that if they continue, then they're going to create the crisis that then they will seize on to escalate.
Yeah, Nadège raised the idea that maybe they might be manipulating risk. We talk a lot about we need to get to some talks with the Chinese about risk reduction, even if they're not ready for arms control, risk reduction. And we've seen, you know, the reports of flying within 10 feet of a B-52 and cutting off ships, all those kinds of things. I'm not sure that China would want those kind of risk reduction talks. When we brought them up in track 1.5, they go, we know how to reduce the risk. You don't send surveillance planes along our coast. You don't fly in those waters that are, you say they're international. They're in our neighborhood. They're not in your neighborhood. You don't do those things, there won't be risks. So I'm not even sure that the risk reduction measures that have been, that everyone wants to see happen are likely to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, it's rare for me to ask you to to stop talking, Admiral. We have someone who's been waiting at the back very patiently, so let's have the second question from the floor here.
I'm Bo Gardner. I'm from 1st Special Forces Group. Just retired out of Indo-Pacom. General Davis, good to see you again. I was division chief out there a year ago. This is actually a request to help me with my homework assignment, which is creating flexible deterrent options for Indo-Pacom. And really it centers around gray zone activities. So as we've seen an increase in gray zone activities from China over the last decade, South China Sea, island reclamations, Hong Kong, Uyghur crisis, etc. Nothing has triggered a U.S. red line. And I'm particularly interested in Ms. Rolland's view from the Chinese side of the house. What actions can we do on the information warfare and influence warfare side of the house that does not reach a Chinese red line that we can do in order to deter China?
Does not reach a Chinese red line, or do you want to reach that Chinese red line?
I want to stay below it. I don't want to go to war with China. So for instance, encouraging with the Taiwan elections coming up in January, encouraging an independence movement or something like that would clearly trigger a PRC red line.
Right.
So obviously, we don't want to suggest that.
No.
So what can we do on the information or influence side of the house in order to stay below that red line?
I think anything that you target towards the regime is going to be like touching up to the red line, but not necessarily like triggering war. But that's clearly the Achilles vulnerability. And so if you want to go on the offensive, I would suggest to be more proactive on the narrative that demises the party's accomplishments, competence. It's probably the US the only one that is going to be able to do that. The Australians have, during the COVID, they basically said we want an independent, inquiry into the origins of COVID, and they were sanctioned for that. And the reason why they were sanctioned for that is that because the CCP was trying to erase their responsibility into the beginning of the pandemic, and that really touched the raw nerve because it was putting in question the competence of the CCP. And today's moment is particularly, I think, good for that because of the problems that the party is facing at home. And that would be I think the red line that you're looking for.
Brian, Elaine, anything to?
Hey, Bo, good to see you in an Aloha shirt. My wife keeps threatening to throw mine away now that I'm not in Hawaii anymore. I think I still have like 15 of them.
Well, sir, I didn't retire as a general, so I can't afford a new wardrobe.
Yeah. No, my wife takes all my money. Yeah, that's actually a great question. So, the Chinese aren't exactly clear on all of their red lines either. I think Taiwan's pretty clear, but if you look internal discussions in the United States, I don't know if we're clear on what those red lines are, even when it comes to Taiwan, because what we've seen with and I've been a part of the Taiwan relationship since I was in the Pentagon 2004 to 6 and then was stationed in AIT, but that relationship has evolved significantly with Taiwan. And so far, there have obviously been repercussions in the U.S.-China relationship, but nobody has been killed over it. And at what point do we reach that red line? And it obviously, yes, recognize the Republic of China as the one government of China, or station U.S. military troops, uniform U.S. military troops in Taiwan, or whatever else. But I don't know if we understand where that red line is. And, I'm an advocate of increased security cooperation with Taiwan to aid in their self-defense, but we have to be very careful. And I think one thing, if you look at flexible deterrent options, China's pretty good at gaming out what the U.S. response to any situation will be. So we have to do it in a way that is unanticipated to give the party and the PLA pause. And I don't necessarily know what those are. I don't think threatening the existence of the Chinese Communist Party is one that we should exercise. But what else does the party hold dear? Economic development, perhaps? But even there might be a red. So it's a good question, but it's a hard one to answer.
If it were up to me, I would do away with the term red line in the national security arena completely. Why? Because if you draw a red line and you say, this is the red line, then the other guy's going to step right up to it and try not to cross it. So that's a problem. The other problem is, I don't know that we know where our red lines are, or that others know necessarily specific actions that are a red line. It's kind of like pornography. You'll know it when you see it, but it's hard for both those reasons. I'm not a big fan of the term red lines. You're looking for deterrent options that I know what you're trying to get at, but I'll leave it there.
All right. And sad to say, we'll have to leave it there. We could keep going, but we've got 4 panels to get through today. So please join me in thanking our 3 speakers, Elaine Bunn, Brian Davis, Nadège Rolland.